All right, welcome back to our second video here in online week one. In this video here, we're going to discuss more about the Great Depression. We'll also talk about a group called the Bonus Army, which is a group of American veterans during the Depression. And then we'll wrap up this video discussing the Dust Bowl. So starting off with the Great Depression, we mentioned in the previous video how the value of companies traded on the New York Stock Exchange, which is the largest stock exchange in our country, but one of few, had increased by threefold. It had gone from around $27 billion in 1925 up to $87 billion by 29. Well, over the next few years, by 1932, the end of Herbert Hoover's presidency, the value has now dropped down to $15 billion. So it's about 1/6 of what it was at the beginning of the Depression. So a massive loss of wealth for all American companies, as well as investors. Because of this, all those speculators that had taken out loans to invest, they've lost all their monies. The banks are not going to be repaid the loans that they had sent out to those speculators. And when savers started to people that had saved money in savings accounts realized they weren't getting paid back. They took whatever money they did have in the banks out. So there's really no trust in the banks. People are hiding their pennies under their bed. They want nothing to do with banks, and that really makes it very difficult to have an economy without a banking system. Herbert Hoover, the president during this time period, really didn't think it was the place of the government to get involved here. He believed in, again, as a self-made man himself, he wanted American ingenuity, the individual, their own hard work and work ethic to pull America through this. He wanted business leaders to take the initiative and find ways to make it work. Unfortunately, when problems get this big, when you have unemployment up in double digits, and during his presidency it rose as high as 25% of the country, ingenuity is not enough. The government really needed to step in and do something. The government had already promised World War I veterans a retirement bonus that they would receive in the 1940s. However, because things are so bad, many of these World War I veterans decided to go to Washington, D.C. and ask Congress to pay them their bonus early. So in 1932, a large group of veterans went there, but were denied by Congress their bonuses early. So they had nowhere else to go. They couldn't afford to travel back home. They decided to set up camp there in Washington, D.C., in what became known as a Hooverville. That people started using Herbert Hoover's name for a variety of examples of how bad the country was. So you have these things known as shanty towns. You'll see pictures of them in the notes where people are living in shacks and in public places in Washington, D.C., and really all over the country. You also have what's called a Hoover flag, which here is an example of a Hoover flag. If you have your pocket just hanging out because you have no money, that's a Hoover flag. So again, Hoover's popularity is doing very poorly, but the government didn't feel very comfortable having hundreds, if not thousands, of former soldiers camped out in Washington, D.C. They were concerned. We'd just gone through the Red Scare. The Soviet Union had just lost their government, their whole royal family. So the government decided to forcibly remove the bonus army from Washington, D.C. They sent General Douglas MacArthur, who had served both in World War I and eventually will serve in World War II, in to remove the bonus army. And they used tanks and soldiers with rifles, and obviously Americans were pretty upset to see that these heroes that had helped protect democracy in World War I forcibly removed and treated poorly. So Hoover, who already had very little popularity, is becoming really hated by Americans at this time period. Also, with all of this going on, not just economic problems, we're having agricultural problems too. So while all of this is going on in the East and in the Midwest, we're about to enter into what's called the Dust Bowl. If you remember, we talked about the Homestead Act from 1860 that President Lincoln had authorized that encouraged Americans to move to the Midwestern states. They get 160 acres of free land if they'd improve it. Well, you have more and more people moving out west, and now you're starting to get overproduction. The more people are growing corn or wheat or any of the crops that are grown out west, the higher the supply, and therefore the lower the price will be for those items, which is great for the consumer, but bad for the producers, for those farmers. So now, if the value of the corn that you can grow on, say, 40 acres of land is not enough to pay off all of your cost. You have to start growing on more acres of land. And they started to grow on all of their land. So instead of rotating the crop from one part of their land to another year to year, they would grow on all the land, taking all the nutrients out of the soil, not giving it a chance to recover. So that really weakened the soil. Then a large drought hit, and the soil became even lighter, and it started getting pulled up by the wind and led to what's called the Dust Bowl. So you'd have these just massive clouds of dust rolling through the Midwest. It made it impossible to plant or grow anything, and it made it almost nearly impossible to breathe. So everybody decided to get out of the Midwest. You don't want to go east because there's plenty of problems there, so they went west. And many people started a mass migration out to California. And in fact, that's detailed by an American writer named John Steinbeck, who wrote a couple of notable books about that. The Grapes of Wrath, which shows people getting into these large open vehicles called jalopies and traveling out west, hoping to find something better. And also of Mice and Men, which hopefully you've read in school, about Lenny and George, a couple of migrant farmers that going from place to place in California. I won't spoil that story for you if you haven't read it. So that wraps up our talk on the Great Depression, the Bonus Army, and the Dust Bowl. In the next video, we're going to talk about the New Deal that America is going to get through President Franklin Roosevelt, and we'll get to that here next. See you in a bit.